The rain hammered against the tin roof of the makeshift military compound in Okinawa, each drop echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of August 1945. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But death still had work to do. Private James Takeshi Nakamura stood at attention in the muddy courtyard, his American uniform soaked through to his skin, watching as military police led a young Korean woman across the compound in heavy iron chains. Her bare feet sank into the mud with each shuffling step, leaving shallow impressions that filled immediately with rainwater, as if the earth itself wanted to erase her existence. Her name was Ji-woo Han, and in less than an hour, she would be executed by firing squad for espionage against Allied forces. What James didn't know yet, what nobody in that rain-soaked courtyard could have predicted, was that an empty metal plate in his field pack would become the most important object he'd ever hold, and the reason behind his final gesture to this condemned woman would haunt him, inspire him, and define him for the rest of his life. James had spent the entire war trying to prove he was American enough. It was an exhausting, endless performance that began long before he ever put on a uniform. Born in Sacramento, California in 1917, to Japanese immigrants who'd come to America chasing the promise of opportunity, James grew up straddling two worlds that never quite aligned. At school, he was Jimmy, speaking perfect English, playing baseball, pledging allegiance to the flag every morning. At home, he was Takeshi, speaking Japanese with his parents, eating rice and miso soup, learning about respect and duty, and the importance of family honor. His father, Hiroshi Nakamura, ran a small grocery store in Japantown. His mother, Keiko, took in sewing to help make ends meet. They were hard-working, law-abiding, deeply patriotic Americans who happened to have Japanese faces. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. James was 24 years old, working as a clerk in his father's store when news of the Pearl Harbor attack crackled through the radio. He remembered the sick feeling in his stomach, the immediate understanding that everything was about to change. Within days, FBI agents were rounding up community leaders. Within weeks, Executive Order 9066 was signed. Within months, James and his family were forced to sell their store for a fraction of its worth, pack what they could carry, and report to an assembly center. They were given numbered tags to wear, like livestock, like property, like enemies. Manzanar War Relocation Center became their home for the next 2 years. 10,000 people crammed into tar paper barracks in the California desert, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers with machine guns pointed inward. The temperature soared to over 100 degrees in summer and dropped below freezing in winter. Dust storms turned the air brown and made breathing painful. Families were crammed into single rooms with no privacy, no dignity. James watched his father age 10 years in 10 months. Hiroshi had always been a proud man, a provider, someone who believed that hard work and good character would earn respect in America. The camp broke that belief. He stopped talking much. He stopped looking people in the eye. He just sat on his cot and stared at the walls. James couldn't bear it. The helplessness, the humiliation, the rage that had nowhere to go. When the Army announced they were forming an all-Japanese American combat unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, James volunteered immediately. Many in the camps were furious at the idea. How could the government imprison them and then ask them to fight? How could they be loyal to a country that treated them as enemies? But James saw it differently. He saw it as a chance to prove something, not just to America, but to himself. He would show them that his loyalty wasn't determined by his face. He would bleed red, white, and blue. He would earn the right to be called American. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became legendary. They fought in Italy, France, and Germany, facing some of the most brutal combat of the European theater. Their motto was, "Go for broke," and they lived up to it. They earned more than 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor, making them the most decorated unit of their size in American military history. But those medals came at a terrible price. The 442nd suffered a casualty rate of over 90%. James saw friends cut down by machine gun fire in the mountains of Italy. He held Kenny Yamamoto while medics tried desperately to save his arm after a mortar blast at Monte Cassino. He wrote letters to mothers, wives, and girlfriends back in the camps, trying to find words to explain why their sons and husbands and boyfriends had died, fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. Every battle was a test. Every wound was a badge. Every medal was proof. James collected them all, not out of pride, but out of desperate need to validate his existence. See? He wanted to scream at everyone back home. See what we did? See what we sacrificed? We're Americans too. We belong here too. But even as he fought, even as he proved himself again and again, a question gnawed at him. Why should he have to prove anything at all? After the European theater, the 442nd was redeployed to the Pacific. By the summer of 1945, the Allies were tightening the noose around Japan. Okinawa had fallen after one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died. Over 100,000 Okinawan civilians died. 12,000 Americans died. The island was a graveyard, a moonscape of shattered trees and bombed-out buildings and bodies that couldn't be buried fast enough in the tropical heat. The smell of death was everywhere, inescapable, seeping into clothes and hair and lungs. In the chaos of occupation, Allied forces began discovering things that would shake even the most battle-hardened soldiers. Hidden in the remnants of Japanese military installations, they found women. Dozens of them at first, then hundreds as more facilities were uncovered. They were skeletal, traumatized, many unable to speak. Some were Japanese, but most were Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian. They had been imprisoned in what the Japanese military euphemistically called comfort stations. The official records described them as volunteers, women who'd willingly signed up to provide recreation services for soldiers. The reality was kidnapping, coercion, systematic rape, and unspeakable brutality. These were the comfort women, victims of one of the largest organized systems of sexual slavery in modern history. The scale of it was staggering. Estimates suggested that up to 200,000 women had been forced into this system throughout the war. Some were kidnapped directly from their homes. Others were tricked with promises of factory work or nursing jobs. Many were teenagers, some as young as 12 years old. They were transported to military installations across the Japanese Empire, from Manchuria to Burma, from the Philippines to the Pacific Islands. They were locked in small rooms, given numbers instead of names, and forced to service dozens of soldiers every single day. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or violence. Those who survived often faced sterilization or were killed when bases were evacuated to eliminate evidence. The comfort women discovered in Okinawa were among the lucky ones, if such a word could even apply. They had survived, but survival came with its own horrors. Many were so traumatized they couldn't function. Some had been imprisoned for so long, they didn't know the war was ending. All of them bore physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The American military didn't quite know what to do with them. Medical personnel treated their immediate physical needs. Interpreters tried to document their stories, though many women were too ashamed or too broken to speak. Plans were made to repatriate them to their home countries, but that process was slow and complicated. Ji-woo Han was among the women found in Okinawa. At 22 years old, she looked at least a decade older. Her hair was thin and brittle. Her skin was sallow, stretched tight over prominent bones. But it was her eyes that James noticed first when he saw her being processed through the military compound. They held an emptiness he recognized, that particular look of someone whose humanity had been systematically stripped away. He'd seen it in the faces of concentration camp survivors in Europe. He'd seen it in his father's eyes in Manzanar. It was the look of someone who had been reduced to a thing, an object, a number. Ji-woo's story, pieced together through painful interviews with interpreters, was horrific even by the standards of what had been discovered. She had been born in a small farming village in Korea in 1923, when Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. Her family was poor but close-knit. Her father grew rice. Her mother took care of Ji-woo and her younger sister, Nisei. Life was hard under Japanese occupation, but they survived. Ji-woo went to school when she could, helped in the fields, dreamed of maybe becoming a teacher someday. In 1940, when Ji-woo was 17, men came to her village. They wore Japanese military uniforms and carried official-looking papers. They said they were recruiting young women for important war work in factories in Manchuria. The pay would be good, they promised. The girls would be well taken care of. It was a chance to serve the empire, to help their families, to see the world beyond their small village. Ji-woo's father was suspicious. But the men made it clear that cooperation wasn't optional. Quotas had to be met. If Jiwoo didn't volunteer, they would simply take her sister instead. So Jiwoo went, telling herself it would only be for a little while, that she'd earn money and come home and everything would be fine. There was no factory. There was a military truck that took her and 30 other girls to a train station. There were armed guards who made sure nobody tried to escape. There was a long journey north into Manchuria, to a military base near the Chinese border. There was a small building divided into tiny rooms, each barely large enough for a thin mattress on the floor. There was a Japanese officer who told them they would be serving the soldiers, that resistance would be punished, that they should feel honored to support the empire. There was the first soldier, and then the second, and then Jiwoo stopped counting. For 5 years, Jiwoo existed in a hell that most people couldn't imagine. She was given a Japanese name, Yoshiko, and referred to by number 7. She was forced to service between 30 and 50 soldiers per day, sometimes more on weekends or before units shipped out to combat. She was beaten if she resisted. She was denied food if she didn't smile. She contracted venereal diseases that went untreated. She became pregnant twice and was forced to undergo crude abortions that left her unable to have children. She watched other girls die from disease, from violence, from suicide. She learned to separate her mind from her body, to float somewhere above herself while it happened, to pretend she was back home in her village, helping her mother prepare dinner, listening to her sister laugh. The only thing that kept Jiwoo alive was the thought of Minseo. Her younger sister had been only 14 when Jiwoo left. Jiwoo clung to the hope that by sacrificing herself, she had saved Minseo from the same fate. That hope was shattered in 1943 when a new group of girls arrived at the comfort station. Among them was Minseo. The recruiters had come back to their village. They'd taken her sister anyway. Jiwoo saw Minseo across the compound, tried to run to her, but was stopped by guards. Minseo was sent to a different comfort station. Jiwoo never saw her again. She never knew if Minseo survived. That's when something inside Jiwoo broke completely. The hope that had sustained her was gone. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to save. She became hollow, going through the motions of survival without any real will to live. Until Captain Takeshi Hiroshi, a Japanese intelligence officer, took an interest in her. Hiroshi was different from the other soldiers. He was educated, spoke multiple languages, and seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort station system. He began requesting Jiwoo specifically, not for the usual purposes, but to talk. He would sit in her tiny room and practice his Korean. He would tell her about the war, about how Japan was losing, about how everything was falling apart. And slowly, carefully, he began asking her questions. Had she seen troop movements? Had she overheard soldiers talking about deployments? Could she tell him what units had passed through? At first, Jiwoo said nothing. But Hiroshi was patient. He brought her extra food. He made sure she received medical treatment. And then one day, he made her an offer. If she helped him gather information, if she paid attention and reported what she learned, he would use his influence to find out what happened to Minseo. He would try to get her sister released, or at least transferred to a safer location. It might not work, he admitted, but it was a chance. The only chance Jiwoo had. So she became a spy. Not out of loyalty to Japan, not out of political conviction, but out of desperate, irrational hope that maybe, somehow, she could save her sister. She listened when drunk soldiers talked about ship movements. She memorized unit insignias. She passed information to Hiroshi whenever he visited. She had no idea if any of it was useful. She had no idea if Hiroshi was even really trying to help find Minseo. She just knew that this small act of agency, this tiny bit of control in a life where she had none, was the only thing keeping her from complete despair. When the Americans invaded Okinawa in April 1945, the Japanese military evacuated most of the comfort stations. Many women were killed to eliminate evidence. Jiwoo survived only because the evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. She was found by American soldiers, barely alive, in the ruins of the comfort station. She was processed as a victim, given medical care, and placed in a temporary shelter with other survivors. For a few weeks, Jiwoo allowed herself to believe that maybe, finally, the nightmare was over. Then the military police came. They had found documents in a captured Japanese intelligence office, maps with markings in Korean, reports about Allied ship movements, a list of names, including one that might have been Ji-woo's real name, though the characters were smudged. And a Korean prisoner, desperate to bargain for his own life, claimed he'd seen a comfort woman meeting with a Japanese officer, passing information. The description matched Ji-woo. The interrogation was brutal. Ji-woo, who barely spoke English and whose Korean was rusty from years of being forced to speak Japanese, tried to explain. She tried to make them understand about Nisei U.S, about the impossible choice she'd faced, about how she'd been a victim long before she'd been a collaborator. But the evidence seemed clear. The military tribunal that decided her fate took less than an hour. Espionage during wartime. Aiding the enemy. Death by firing squad. Sentence to be carried out immediately. Captain Robert Mitchell, the officer assigned to oversee the execution, was a by-the-book career military man from Boston. He'd joined the Army in 1935, worked his way up through the ranks, and prided himself on following orders without question. He'd overseen executions before, deserters mostly, and the occasional enemy combatant caught behind lines. He didn't enjoy it, but he understood it as a necessary part of military justice. The law was the law. Orders were orders. Personal feelings didn't enter into it. But this case bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Mitchell had been part of the force that liberated one of the comfort stations. He'd seen the conditions. He'd watched medics treat women who'd been starved and beaten and raped for years. He'd read some of the testimonies, though he couldn't stomach more than a few pages. How could someone who'd endured that be considered a collaborator? What kind of choice was that? But the evidence was there. The tribunal had ruled. His job was to carry out the sentence, not to question it. James Takeshi Nakamura was assigned to the execution detail along with 5 other soldiers, including Sergeant Frank O'Connor. O'Connor was a gruff Irishman from Brooklyn who'd been in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. He'd seen more death than most men could process and had developed a cynical, dark humor as a coping mechanism. Nothing shocked him anymore. Nothing moved him. Or so he claimed. As they prepared the courtyard on the morning of August 15, 1945, O'Connor lit a cigarette and watched the rain. Another day in paradise, Nakamura. You ever think about how completely messed up this all is? We're executing a woman who was already a prisoner, a victim. What's she supposed to be guilty of? Trying to survive? James didn't respond immediately. He was checking his rifle, making sure it was clean and loaded, going through the mechanical motions that kept his mind from thinking too much. But O'Connor's words hit home. Orders are orders, James finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yeah, that's what they said at Nuremberg too, O'Connor muttered. Just following orders. Look, I'm not saying we don't do it. I'm just saying it doesn't sit right. That girl's been through hell already. James knew O'Connor was right, but acknowledging it made everything harder. He'd spent years trying not to think too deeply about the moral complexities of war. You followed orders. You did your duty. You didn't question. Questioning led to paralysis, and paralysis got people killed. But standing in that rain-soaked courtyard, waiting to execute a woman who'd been enslaved and brutalized by the same enemy he'd been fighting, James felt the careful walls he'd built around his conscience beginning to crumble. Private Kenny Yamamoto found James before the execution. Kenny had been James's closest friend since basic training. They'd fought side by side through Italy and France. Kenny had lost his left arm below the elbow at Monte Cassino but refused to be sent home, insisting he could still fight. He'd learned to shoot one-handed and rejoined the unit. If anyone understood what James was going through, it was Kenny. Jimmy, you don't have to do this, Kenny said quietly. Talk to Mitchell. Tell him you can't be on the detail. Nobody would blame you. James shook his head. If I don't do it, someone else will. At least I'll make it quick. Clean. That's something, right? Kenny looked at his friend with sad eyes. Is it? I don't know anymore, Jimmy. I used to think I understood what we were fighting for. Freedom, justice, all that. But then I think about our families in the camps while we were bleeding in Europe. I think about what they did to these comfort women. I think about how we're about to execute one of the victims, and I don't understand anything anymore. Before James could respond, Corporal Sam Ito, the Japanese-American interpreter who'd been working with the comfort women survivors, approached them. Sam was older, maybe 35, and carried himself with a quiet intensity. He'd been translating testimonies for weeks, documenting horrors that most people would never know about. Nakamura, Yamamoto, You should know something about Jiwoo Han, Sam said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I interviewed her yesterday for the records. She told me everything, her whole story. Sam described Jiwoo's kidnapping at 17, the 5 years of systematic rape and abuse, the arrival of her younger sister at another comfort station, and the impossible choice she'd faced when the Japanese intelligence officer offered to help find Nisei in exchange for information. She wasn't a collaborator, Sam said. She was a victim who was victimized again. They weaponized her trauma. They turned her desperation into a tool. And now we're going to kill her for it. James felt something break inside him. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about military necessity. This was about a system, multiple systems, that had chewed up a young woman and spit her out. And now that same machinery was going to finish the job. Jiwoo Han had never had a choice. Not really. Not when she was taken from her village. Not when she was forced into sexual slavery. Not when she was offered a chance to save her sister. Every decision had been made under duress, under conditions that stripped away any meaningful notion of free will. Did she ever find out what happened to her sister? James asked. Sam shook his head. No. The officer who promised to help probably lied. Or maybe he tried and failed. Either way, Minseo's fate is unknown. Jiwoo will die never knowing if her sacrifice meant anything. The words hung in the air like the heavy clouds overhead. Kenny turned away, his jaw clenched. James stared at the empty plate in his mess kit, the one he'd been issued in basic training and carried through every battle. He'd eaten thousands of meals from that plate. His mother's rice balls before deployment, K rations in frozen foxholes in France, victory rations after liberating towns in Germany. That plate had sustained him, kept him alive, connected him to the basic human need for nourishment and the comfort it represented. Captain Mitchell called the detail to formation at 0845 hours. The execution was scheduled for 0900. Jiwoo was brought out from the holding area, her wrists and ankles shackled, 2 military policemen supporting her because she could barely walk. She wore a simple gray prison dress that hung on her skeletal frame. Her hair, which might have been beautiful once, was cropped short and dull. But it was her eyes that struck James most powerfully. They were empty, already dead, as if her body was just going through the motions of a soul that had departed long ago. They tied her to a wooden post in the center of the courtyard. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained oppressively gray. Water dripped from the tin roofs of surrounding buildings, creating a rhythmic percussion that seemed to count down the remaining moments of Jiwoo's life. A chaplain approached to offer final rites, but Jiwoo didn't seem to register his presence. She stared straight ahead at nothing, her face expressionless. The chaplain spoke quietly in English, which Jiwoo likely didn't understand. He made the sign of the cross and stepped back. That's when Jiwoo spoke for the first time. Her voice was so quiet that the chaplain had to lean in to hear. She repeated herself slightly louder in Korean. Sam Ito, standing nearby, translated immediately. She says she hasn't eaten in 3 days. She says she just wanted one more meal, just one more taste of home before she dies. The request hung in the air. Captain Mitchell looked uncomfortable. We don't have provisions for that. The execution is scheduled for 0900. We're already behind schedule. Jiwoo spoke again, her voice barely audible. Sam translated. She's not asking for real food. She just wants to remember. She wants to close her eyes and taste her mother's cooking one more time. She wants to die with that memory, instead of all the others. Mitchell didn't know how to respond. This wasn't covered in any manual. There was no protocol for a condemned prisoner's request to remember food. We don't have time for this. Proceed with the execution. But those words, that simple human desire for one last comfort, one last connection to a life before everything was taken away, broke something fundamental in James Takeshi Nakamura. He thought about his own mother, Keiko, and the rice balls she used to make. Simple things, just rice and a bit of pickled plum wrapped in seaweed, but they represented everything. Home, family, love, belonging. He thought about how food was never just sustenance. It was memory made tangible. It was culture, identity, connection to the people and places that made you who you were. In the internment camp, when everything else had been stripped away, when they were reduced to numbers and barracks assignments, the small acts of preparing and sharing food had been acts of resistance, assertions of humanity in a system designed to dehumanize. His mother had made those rice balls with precious ingredients hoarded and traded, and every bite had been a reminder that they were still a family, still Japanese, still human, despite everything. And now Jiwoo Han, who had endured unimaginable horrors, who was about to be executed for the crime of trying to save her sister, wanted one last moment of that same connection. She wanted to remember her mother's kimchi, the taste of home, the feeling of being loved and safe and human. It was the smallest possible request, and it had been denied. James made a decision that defied every rule, every protocol, every expectation of military discipline. During a brief delay as Captain Mitchell reviewed the final execution order paperwork, James set down his rifle and reached into his field pack. He pulled out his mess kit and removed the small metal plate. He wiped it carefully with his sleeve, making sure it was completely clean. Then, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to alarm the guards, he walked toward Jiwoo. The soldiers around the courtyard tensed. Sergeant O'Connor called out, "Nakamura, what are you doing? Get back in formation." James ignored him. He walked right up to Jiwoo, who was tied to the post, and held up the empty plate so everyone could see it clearly. It was just a standard military-issue metal plate, scratched and dented from years of use but completely empty. No food. Nothing. Captain Mitchell's hand went to his holster. "Private Nakamura, return to your position immediately. That's an order." James looked at Mitchell, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding. Mitchell's hand stayed on his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. He didn't move. He just watched. James turned back to Jiwoo and spoke softly in Japanese, knowing she would understand even if it wasn't her native language. "I can't give you real food, but I can give you this. Pretend with me, just for a moment. Whatever you miss most, whatever your mother used to make, see it on this plate, smell it, taste it. Remember." Jiwoo's empty eyes slowly focused on James's face. She saw his Japanese features, the same face as her tormentors, but also something different in his expression. Compassion, recognition, humanity. Her gaze dropped to the empty plate he held in front of her. James moved the plate closer, holding it at chest level as if presenting a meal. "What do you see?" he asked gently. For a long moment, Jiwoo said nothing. Then, barely audible, she whispered in Korean. Sam Ito translated, his voice breaking. "Kimchi, my mother's kimchi. She made it every autumn with the cabbage from our garden. And rice, white rice, still steaming. And myeokguk, seaweed soup. She made it for my birthday every year." James held the plate steady, not moving, giving her this moment. And then something miraculous happened. Jiwoo's expression changed. The emptiness in her eyes flickered and receded, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Her lips moved as if she was chewing. She swallowed. Another tear rolled down her cheek, but this one seemed different from the others. Not a tear of pain or fear, but of remembrance, of connection to something beautiful that had been lost. "I can taste it," she whispered. "The spice of the kimchi, the garlic, the way it would make my mouth burn and my mother would laugh and give me more rice to cool it down. I can taste it." Around the courtyard, hardened soldiers stood transfixed. Some looked away, uncomfortable with this display of emotion. Others watched with tears in their own eyes. Sergeant O'Connor, the cynic who claimed nothing moved him anymore, turned his back and wiped his face roughly with his sleeve. Kenny Yamamoto stood frozen, his remaining hand clenched into a fist. James continued to hold the plate, his arms beginning to ache but not wavering. "What else do you remember?" he asked. Jiwoo's voice grew slightly stronger, as if the act of remembering was giving her back pieces of herself. "My sister, Minseo. She would always try to steal extra kimchi from the jar when Mother wasn't looking. She thought she was so sneaky, but Mother always knew. Mother would pretend to be angry, but she was smiling. We were happy. We were so happy." "You were loved," James said. "You are loved. Whatever happens next, remember that. You were a daughter. You were a sister. You were loved." Jiwoo looked directly at James, really looked at him, seeing him as a person, rather than just another soldier, another man, another threat. She spoke in halting, broken English, words she must have picked up during her captivity. "Thank you. You have kind face. Japanese face, but American heart. You understand. You know what it is to be two things. To not belong anywhere, but still have heart, still have soul." Her words struck James with the force of a physical blow. She had seen him, truly seen him, understood the fundamental struggle that had defined his entire life, the constant tension between his Japanese heritage and his American identity, the feeling of being perpetually caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither, the desperate need to prove his loyalty, his worth, his right to exist in the space he occupied. Jiwoo, in her final moments, had recognized all of that in him, and in recognizing it had given him something precious, the acknowledgement that his struggle was real, was valid, was seen. "Yes," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand." Jiwoo smiled then. It was a sad, broken smile, but it was genuine. "Then you know. Identity is not face. Identity is heart. What we choose when we have choice. You choose kindness. You choose to see me. Not comfort woman. Not spy. Not enemy. You see Jiwoo. You see human. That is who you are. That is your identity." Captain Mitchell had been standing motionless, watching this exchange. Now he cleared his throat, and his voice when he spoke was rougher than usual. "Private Nakamura, you need to step back now." James nodded. He lowered the plate slowly, as if putting down something infinitely precious. "Goodbye, Jiwoo-han. I will remember you. I will tell your story. You will not be forgotten." "Thank you," Jiwoo said again. "Tell them about Minseo too. Tell them about all the sisters, all the daughters. Tell them we were human, we were loved. We mattered." "I will," James promised. "I swear I will." He stepped back, returning to his position in the firing line. He picked up his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. The empty plate was tucked back in his pack, but he could still feel its weight, as if it had become heavier, filled with something invisible but profound. Captain Mitchell gave the commands in a voice that sounded tired, older than it had that morning. "Firing squad, attention. Ready? Aim." James raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at Jiwoo's chest. She was looking directly at him. No fear in her eyes now, just that same sad, peaceful smile. He thought about everything she'd endured. He thought about the system that had destroyed her. He thought about the impossible choices she'd made. He thought about her sister, Minseo, whose fate would never be known. He thought about all the comfort women, all the victims whose stories would never be told. Fire. The volley cracked through the morning air, 7 rifles firing almost simultaneously. Jiwoo's body jerked against the ropes and then slumped forward, held up only by the bindings. It was over in less than a second. Quick, clean, as merciful as an execution could be. But for James Takeshi Nakamura, it would never be over. He stood there in formation, smoke still rising from his rifle barrel, staring at Jiwoo's body, and he felt something fundamental shift inside him. All the certainty he'd clung to, all the simple narratives about duty and loyalty and proving himself, crumbled like sand. War wasn't simple. Justice wasn't simple. Humanity wasn't simple. And sometimes the systems we served, the orders we followed, the laws we upheld, were fundamentally wrong. The execution detail was dismissed. James walked back to his barracks in a daze, still carrying his rifle, still holding the empty plate. He didn't remember the walk. He didn't remember entering the building. He just found himself sitting on his bunk, staring at the plate in his hands, now splattered with mud from the courtyard. Kenny Yamamoto found him there an hour later. "Jimmy. Hey, Jimmy. You okay?" James looked up at his friend. "We just killed a victim, Kenny. We executed a woman who'd already been destroyed by this war. She was 17 when they took her. 17. The same age as my sister. And we put her against a post and shot her. Because the law said we had to. Because she was a spy. Because she tried to save her sister. And it was legal. It was justified. It was wrong. It was so fundamentally, completely wrong." Kenny sat down beside him on the bunk. "I know, Jimmy. I know." "No," James said, his voice rising. "I don't think you do. I don't think any of us do. We've been so focused on winning this war, on proving ourselves, on following orders, that we forgot to ask whether the orders were right. Jiwoo-han was a victim. She was trafficked. She was enslaved. She was raped thousands of times over 5 years. And then, when she was desperate and broken and grasping at any hope of saving her sister, she was turned into a spy. She didn't choose any of it. None of it was her choice. And we killed her for it. The tribunal found her guilty, Kenny said quietly. The evidence was there. Evidence of what? James demanded. Evidence that she was human? Evidence that she loved her sister? Evidence that she would do anything, even collaborate with her tormentors, if it meant a chance to save the only family she had left. That's not a crime, Kenny. That's desperation. That's what happens when you strip away every other option, when you reduce someone to nothing and then punish them for trying to survive. Kenny didn't have an answer. There was no answer. They sat in silence. Two Japanese-American soldiers who'd fought for a country that imprisoned their families, now grappling with the execution of a Korean woman who'd been enslaved by Japan and killed by America. The layers of injustice were suffocating. Captain Mitchell appeared in the doorway. "Private Nakamura, I need to speak with you." James stood, expecting disciplinary action for breaking protocol. But Mitchell's expression was complicated, conflicted. "What you did today was highly irregular. You violated procedure. You left your position without authorization." "Yes, sir." Mitchell paused, then continued. "It was also the most human thing I've seen in this entire war. That woman was a victim long before she was labeled a criminal. Maybe we followed the law today, but I'm not convinced we served justice. Keep that plate, Private. Remember what it means. Remember her." After Mitchell left, James sat back down and stared at the empty plate. That night he cleaned it carefully, removing every trace of mud, polishing it until it shone. He never ate from it again. It became something else. A memorial, a reminder, a promise. The war ended days later. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the same day Ji-woo died. James returned to California, to a country still uncertain about Japanese Americans, to a family trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. He married, had children, built a life. But that plate stayed with him, displayed on a shelf in every home he lived in. Decades passed. The comfort women survivors remained silent, carrying their shame in societies that blamed victims. Then, in 1991, Kim Hak-sun became the first Korean comfort woman to publicly testify about her experience. Others followed. A movement was born. Survivors demanded recognition, apology, justice from the Japanese government. The fight continues today, with the few remaining survivors now in their 90s, still waiting for full acknowledgement. James became one of the voices telling their stories. He testified at hearings, spoke at universities, wrote letters to newspapers. He told Ji-woo's story again and again, ensuring she wasn't erased from history. He described the empty plate and what it represented, the recognition of humanity in systems designed to destroy it. Ji-woo Han was executed as a spy, James would say in his talks, his voice steady despite his age. But she was first a daughter, stolen from her home at 17. She was a sister who sacrificed everything trying to save her sibling. She was a victim of one of history's most systematic programs of sexual violence. And in her final moments, all she wanted was to remember her mother's cooking, to taste home one more time. That empty plate wasn't empty at all. It was filled with memory, with dignity, with humanity that no war could completely destroy. The shocking reason behind the empty plate wasn't about food. It was about choice. In a moment when Ji-woo had no choices left, when everything had been stripped away, James chose to see her humanity. He chose compassion over protocol. He chose to give her one last moment of peace, one last connection to the life stolen from her. In doing so, he reclaimed his own humanity too. The comfort women system enslaved an estimated 200,000 women during World War II. Most died in captivity or were killed to eliminate evidence. Survivors faced stigma and silence for decades. Their fight for recognition continues, a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, but that bearing witness still matters. Ji-woo Han's name appears in no official records. She's one of thousands erased by history. But James Nakamura ensured she wasn't completely forgotten. That empty plate, now in the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, stands as her testament. It reminds us that in systems of violence and dehumanization, every act of recognition matters. Every moment we choose to see another person's humanity is resistance against the machinery of cruelty. Ji-woo deserved better than the life forced upon her and the death she suffered. James couldn't change her fate, But he gave her one final gift: acknowledgement that she was more than victim, more than spy, more than number. She was Jiwoo Han, who loved her mother's kimchi, who tried to save her sister, who deserved dignity even at the end. That's the truth behind the empty plate. In that emptiness, James and Jiwoo found something full: shared humanity transcending war, nationality, and brutal circumstances. It was mercy in merciless times, recognition in a system built on erasure. It reminds us that even in darkness, we choose how we treat each other, whether we see enemies or humans, whether we perpetuate cruelty or offer compassion. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Jiwoo's story and the Comfort Women's legacy. Their voices deserve to be heard. Their stories must never be forgotten.